Graduation day was supposed to be a celebration of achievement, a joyful farewell to the trials and tribulations of high school. At Brookfield High, the graduating class of 46 students wore their caps and gowns with pride, their laughter echoing across the sunlit lawn. Parents clapped, cameras flashed, and the principal gave a rehearsed speech about dreams and potential. For a fleeting moment, everything seemed perfect. But beneath the surface of smiles and applause, an inexplicable unease hung in the air, as if the universe itself had paused to watch them. Among the students was Lila Harrington, the quiet artist who preferred sketching in the margins of her notebooks to engaging in small talk. Lila's closest friend, Nate, nudged her with a grin as they waited in line to receive their diplomas. "After night, we're officially free," he whispered. Lila smiled back, but couldn't shake the nagging feeling that their freedom came with strings attached. As the ceremony concluded, the students tossed their caps into the sky, their cheers mingling with the rustling of the wind. It was a tradition as old as the school itself. Yet this year, something felt different. A faint shadow passed over the crowd, unnoticed by most, but keenly observed by Lila. She looked up, expecting to see a bird or a passing cloud, but there was nothing there. Just the clear blue sky. "Lila, come on," Nate called, pulling her back to the present. The graduates had planned an unofficial celebration that evening, away from the watchful eyes of parents and teachers. The destination, an abandoned mansion deep in the woods on the outskirts of town. The house, nicknamed Ravenwood Manor, was a staple of local folklore, rumored to be haunted by the restless spirit of its last owner, a reclusive widow who had vanished without a trace. By sunset, a convoy of cars wound its way through the forest, laughter and music spilling from open windows. Lila sat in the back seat of Nate's car, clutching her sketchbook like a talisman. The stories about Ravenwood had always intrigued her, but now, as they approached the towering silhouette of the house, unease churned in her stomach. The mansion was a marvel of decay, its Gothic architecture cloaked in ivy and shadows. Broken windows glinted like jagged teeth, and the wooden door hung slightly ajar, as if inviting them in. "This place is incredible," said Chloe, the class valedictorian, her voice tinged with nervous excitement. The group hesitated for a moment before spilling out of their cars, flashlights cutting through the gathering darkness. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of damp wood and dust. The grand staircase, though splintered with age, still exuded an eerie elegance. Faded portraits lined the walls, their subjects' eyes seeming to follow the students as they explored. Lila lingered at the edge of the group, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns on the wallpaper. "This is where the widow disappeared," Nate said, pointing to a door at the end of the hallway. "She locked herself in there one night and was never seen again." His tone was light, but his words sent a ripple of unease through the group. Chloe laughed nervously. "Come on, it's just a story. Let's find a spot to set up." The students congregated in the parlor, pushing aside rotting furniture to make room for speakers and snacks. Someone turned up the music, and the house came alive with the sound of celebration. Lila sat in a corner, sketching the outlines of the room, her eyes drifting to the shadows that danced along the walls. It was Nate who first noticed the strange silence outside. "Hey," he said, lowering the volume. "Do you hear that?" The group paused, their laughter fading into the stillness. The forest, which had been alive with the chirping of crickets and rustling leaves, was now eerily quiet. Lila's grip tightened on her pencil as an inexplicable chill swept through the room. None of them said it aloud, but in that moment, they all felt it. They weren't alone. The parlor of Ravenwood Manor, once filled with music and chatter, had gone eerily still. The silence outside seemed unnatural, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. For a few tense moments, the group exchanged uneasy glances, waiting for someone to break the spell. It was Chloe who laughed first, her voice too loud in the hushed room. "Come on, guys. It's just the middle of the woods. No one's out there making noise. Let's not freak ourselves out." Her words seemed to ease the tension, and the music was turned back on, albeit at a lower volume. A few students cracked jokes about the supposed haunting of Ravenwood, their bravado masking the unease that lingered in the air. Nate tossed a bag of chips at Lila, grinning. "You're way too quiet. Draw something creepy for us, artist extraordinaire." Lila forced a smile, her fingers tightening around her sketchbook. She didn't need to draw anything creepy. The house was doing it for her. The faint creaks of the wooden floorboards, the flickering of their flashlights against cracked mirrors, and the way the shadows seemed to stretch and twist. It all felt like a story she'd rather not illustrate. Meanwhile, the group began to spread out, exploring the mansion. Small clusters of students ventured into different rooms, their laughter echoing faintly down the hallways. Lila stayed behind, sitting on a faded armchair near the fireplace, her eyes darting between the open doorway and her sketchbook. "Don't let the house get to you," Nate said, plopping down on the arm of her chair. "It's just an old building with a bad reputation. Nothing here can hurt us." His voice was light, but the tightness around his eyes betrayed his own unease. Lila nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling that the house was more than just wood and stone. In the dining room, Chloe and a few others found an antique chandelier that still hung precariously from the ceiling. "Imagine the dinner parties they used to have here," she said, brushing cobwebs off a broken chair. "It must have been incredible." As she spoke, a sharp crack echoed through the room. The group froze, their eyes darting to the chandelier, but it remained in place. "Probably just the wind," someone muttered. Back in the parlor, Lila stood, her curiosity getting the better of her. She wandered into the hallway, her footsteps muffled by the threadbare carpet. The walls were adorned with faded portraits, each subject staring out with an unsettling intensity. One painting in particular caught her eye, a woman in a black gown, her expression unreadable. As Lila stepped closer, she noticed something peculiar. The woman's hand seemed to point toward the end of the hall, where a door hung slightly ajar. "Hey, wait up!" Nate called, catching up to her. "You're not going down there alone, are you?" Lila hesitated, glancing at the painting again. "It's just, I thought I saw something." Nate rolled his eyes but followed her as she approached the door. It opened with a soft creak, revealing a narrow staircase that spiraled downward into darkness. "Basement," Nate said, his voice tinged with nervous excitement. "This is where all the creepy stuff happens in movies, right?" Lila didn't respond. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stared into the abyss. Something about the air coming from below felt wrong, too cold, too stale. Before she could decide whether to step forward, a scream pierced the air, cutting through the muffled music and chatter. Lila and Nate turned, their blood running cold as the sound echoed through the hallways. They weren't sure who had screamed or where it had come from, but one thing was clear. The night was only beginning, and Ravenwood Manor had more in store for them than they could have imagined. The scream jolted the entire group, shattering the fragile sense of safety they had been clinging to. Lila and Nate exchanged a glance, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. From the parlor, other students came rushing into the hallway, their footsteps echoing off the creaking floorboards. Chloe emerged from the dining room, clutching her phone like a lifeline. "Who screamed?" she demanded, her voice trembling. No one answered. The silence stretched thin, pressing against their ears like a suffocating weight. Lila's mind raced as she scanned the faces around her. Everyone was accounted for, but that only deepened the mystery. The scream had been sharp, raw, and distinctly human. It hadn't come from any of them. "It came from upstairs," said Jordan, a lanky boy who had been leaning against the parlor doorway moments before. His voice wavered, and he gestured toward the grand staircase. The group hesitated, their eyes drawn to the shadowed steps that twisted upward into the unknown. "We should check it out," Chloe said, trying to steady her voice. "It's probably just, I don't know, someone messing with us." But her bravado faltered as she glanced toward the upper floor. The house loomed around them, its oppressive silence broken only by the faint creaks of settling wood. Nate stepped forward, his jaw tight. "Fine, I'll go." He looked back at Lila, his usual playful grin replaced by a strained expression. "You coming?" She hesitated, clutching her sketchbook as if it could shield her from whatever awaited them. Finally, she nodded, falling in a step behind him as they ascended the staircase. The second floor was colder, the air heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. Faint moonlight streamed through broken windows, casting jagged shadows across the warped floorboards. The hallway stretched ahead of them, lined with doors that seemed to watch them like hollow eyes. "Hello," Nate called, his voice echoing down the corridor. There was no response. He glanced at Lila, who had stopped in front of one of the doors. It was slightly ajar, and a faint flicker of movement caught her eye. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Before Nate could answer, a soft sound drifted through the air, whispering. It was faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but it grew louder as they stood frozen in the hallway. The voices were indistinct, overlapping in a murmur that sent shivers down Lila's spine. "Who's there?" Nate demanded, his voice breaking the spell. The whispering stopped abruptly, plunging them back into silence. Lila's heart thundered in her chest as she stepped closer to the door, her fingers trembling as she pushed it open. The room beyond was empty, save for a cracked mirror hanging on the wall. Lila's breath caught in her throat as she stared into the glass. For a moment, she thought she saw something move, a shadow flitting across the reflection. But when she turned, there was nothing there. "Let's go," Nate said, his voice tight. He grabbed her arm, pulling her back into the hallway. As they turned to leave, a loud crash echoed from downstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of shattering glass. The two of them bolted down the staircase, their fear driving them faster than their legs could carry. In the parlor, the rest of the group stood in stunned silence, staring at the fireplace. The ornate mirror above the mantel had shattered, shards of glass littering the floor. No one spoke, but their collective dread was palpable. Lila's eyes darted to the broken mirror and then to the faces of her classmates. Something was happening, something none of them could explain. And as the whispering voices lingered in her mind, she realized that whatever force was at work in Ravenwood Manor, it wasn't about to let them leave unscathed. The group stared at the shattered mirror, its jagged shards catching the dim light and scattering it across the room like fragments of broken stars. Chloe knelt near the fireplace, carefully picking up a piece of glass. "It just fell," she murmured, though her voice betrayed her doubt. The frame of the mirror had been sturdy, its gilded edges tarnished but intact when they had arrived. The crash didn't feel accidental. It felt deliberate. "We shouldn't stay here," Lila said, her voice trembling. "Something is seriously wrong with this place." She clutched her sketchbook tightly, the soft leather binding now damp from her clammy hands. Nate, standing beside her, nodded grimly but didn't speak. "What? You think the house is haunted?" Jordan scoffed, though the tremor in his voice gave away his fear. He gestured toward the fireplace. "It's just an old building falling apart. Creepy, sure, but nothing supernatural." But the room itself seemed to disagree. A draft swirled through the parlor, extinguishing the candles that had been placed around the mantel. The students flinched as the shadows deepened, the moonlight outside their only remaining source of illumination. The wind shouldn't have been able to reach them. It hadn't before. What if the scream we heard earlier came from someone who's still here? Lila asked, her words hanging heavy in the air. The possibility sent a ripple of unease through the group, and even Jordan didn't have a retort. Chloe straightened, brushing glass dust from her hands. "If someone's in trouble, we need to find them," she said, her tone resolute. She glanced at Nate, who was fiddling nervously with his flashlight. "Let's split up again, but this time we stick in pairs. No one goes alone." The group reluctantly agreed, pairing off and venturing into different parts of the house. Lila and Nate found themselves drawn back to the narrow staircase they had discovered earlier, the one leading down into the basement. The air near the stairs was colder than before, carrying a faint metallic tang that made Lila's stomach churn. "Are you sure about this?" Nate asked, shining his flashlight down the steps. The beam barely penetrated the darkness, the inky blackness below seeming to swallow the light whole. "No," Lila admitted, "but we have to check." Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. With a deep breath, she descended the staircase, Nate close behind her. The wooden steps groaned under their weight, each creak echoing like a warning. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a cavernous basement. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the scent of earth and decay. The faint glow of Nate's flashlight revealed walls lined with crumbling bricks and shelves cluttered with strange objects. Rusted tools, dusty jars filled with unidentifiable substances, and scraps of faded paper. "What is all this?" Nate whispered, picking up one of the jars. Its contents were murky, something gelatinous suspended in the viscous liquid. Lila didn't answer. Her attention was drawn to the far corner of the room, where a large, ornate trunk sat covered in cobwebs. As if compelled by an unseen force, she approached the trunk, her footsteps muffled by the dirt floor. Nate followed, his flashlight trembling in his grip. "Lila, maybe we shouldn't," but she was already pulling at the trunk's latch. It gave way with a groan, and the lid creaked open to reveal its contents. Inside were dozens of photographs, each one yellowed with age. The faces in the pictures were eerily familiar. Young people dressed in clothes from decades past, their expressions frozen in smiles that didn't reach their eyes. "These are graduation photos," Lila said, her voice barely above a whisper. She flipped through them, her hands trembling. The same background appeared in every picture, the front steps of Ravenwood Manor. Nate leaned closer, his breath hitching as he pointed to a photograph near the bottom of the pile. "Lila," he said, his voice shaky. "That's us." She froze, staring at the photo in his hand. There they were, her, Nate, Chloe, and the rest of their group, posing in front of the manor, their smiles forced and uneasy. The only problem was that none of them had taken the picture. And beneath the photo, written in spidery handwriting, was a date, 1987. The revelation sent a cold wave of fear crashing over them. Lila's mind raced as she struggled to make sense of what she was seeing. "This doesn't make any sense," she muttered, backing away from the trunk. "It's impossible." A sudden noise shattered the silence, a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Lila and Nate froze, their hearts pounding in unison. The whispering from before returned, louder this time, and accompanied by the faint sound of footsteps echoing down the stairs. "Run," Nate said, grabbing her hand. They bolted up the staircase, their footsteps a frantic cacophony against the creaking wood. Behind them, the whispering grew louder, more insistent, as if the house itself was alive and calling them back. When they reached the parlor, they found the others huddled together, their faces pale and their eyes wide. "What happened?" Chloe demanded. But before either of them could answer, the front door slammed shut with a deafening finality. They were trapped, and whatever secrets Ravenwood Manor held, it wasn't going to let them go easily. The slamming of the door echoed through the manor, reverberating off the decayed walls like the tolling of a grim bell. The group huddled closer, their faces illuminated only by the feeble beams of their flashlights. The oppressive silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by their shallow, panicked breaths. "Okay," Chloe said, her voice tight but trying to stay calm. "We're not trapped. We just need to find another way out." She glanced toward the tall windows in the parlor, but their thick panes, covered in grime and cobwebs, offered no view of the world outside. "Maybe there's a back door, or something." "No," Lila interrupted, her voice trembling but firm. She clutched the photograph they had found in the basement, holding it up for everyone to see. "We need to talk about this first. This isn't normal." The others gathered around, squinting at the image. The sight of their own faces staring back from a decades-old photo sent a collective shiver through the group. "How is this even possible?" Jordan muttered, shaking his head. "We weren't even born in 1987. We don't have time for this," Nate interjected, pacing nervously. "Whatever's happening here, we need to focus on getting out. The house is..." He hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "It's playing games with us." As if to punctuate his statement, the faint sound of laughter echoed from somewhere above them. It was soft and fleeting like a child's giggle, but it sent a cold chill down their spines. Chloe turned sharply toward the staircase. "No one else heard that?" "I heard it," Lila whispered, her eyes darting toward the shadows creeping along the walls. It's like the house is alive. They decided to search the ground floor for another exit, sticking together this time. Every step they took seemed amplified, their movements disturbingly loud against the eerie stillness. They found a dining room with a long, rotting table, a kitchen with rusted appliances and peeling wallpaper, and a library filled with books whose spines were warped with age. But every door and window they encountered was either locked or boarded up from the outside. In the library, Lila noticed a peculiar book resting on a pedestal in the center of the room. Unlike the others, its cover was pristine, as though untouched by time. The title, embossed in gold, read The Unseen Gate. She hesitated before opening it, her fingers trembling as she flipped through its pages. The book wasn't a novel or a history text, as she'd expected. It was a journal. The handwriting inside was frantic and uneven, the entries detailing the experiences of someone who had stayed in Ravenwood Manor decades earlier. Words like trapped, whispering walls, and the gate cannot be opened jumped out at her, each one tightening the knot of fear in her chest. "What's it say?" Chloe asked, peering over Lila's shoulder. Lila hesitated, then read aloud, "The house feeds on fear. It shows you what you dread most, traps you in its endless corridors. But there's a gate a way out. Only it's hidden, and it demands a price." "What kind of price?" Jordan asked, his voice cracking. Before Lila could answer, the pages of the book began to flutter wildly, as though caught in an invisible wind. The group stumbled back, watching in horror as the book slammed shut with a resounding thud. The lights in their flashlights flickered, plunging the room into intermittent darkness. When the lights steadied again, the library looked different. The books on the shelves were gone, replaced by rows of blackened candles, their flames burning a deep, unsettling blue. The air grew heavy, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed from the doorway. The group turned as one, their flashlights revealing a shadowy figure standing just beyond the threshold. It was tall and vaguely humanoid, its form shrouded in flickering darkness. The figure didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, filling the room with a primal, unexplainable terror. "Run!" Nate shouted, grabbing Lila's arm. The group bolted from the library, their screams swallowed by the labyrinthine halls of Ravenwood Manor. Behind them, the shadow pursued, silent but unrelenting, as though the house itself had come alive to claim its newest prey. This wasn't a game anymore. The house had decided it was time to show its true nature, and it wasn't going to let them escape without paying its price. The group barreled down the dimly lit corridors of Ravenwood Manor, their footsteps echoing in chaotic rhythm. Their breaths were ragged, hearts pounding in unison, but the shadow that pursued them never faltered. It neither sped up nor slowed down, its movements as inexorable as time itself. Every turn they took seemed to lead them deeper into the house's dark labyrinth, its architecture shifting like a cruel puzzle designed to trap them. Nate led the way, gripping the flashlight so tightly his knuckles whitened. "We need to split up," he shouted, his voice tinged with desperation. "If it's following all of us, maybe we can—" "No!" Lila interrupted, her tone sharp despite her fear. "That's exactly what it wants. Haven't you noticed? The house is dividing us already. Splitting us up will just make it stronger." As if to mock her assertion, the walls around them began to groan, their wood creaking as though alive. The corridor narrowed, forcing them to slow down, their shoulders brushing against the cold, damp surfaces. The flickering lights from their flashlights painted the walls with grotesque shadows, and for a moment, it felt as though the house was closing in on them. They stumbled into a large room, gasping for breath. The space was circular, with no windows or visible exits. At the center stood a strange pedestal made of black stone, its surface polished to a mirror-like sheen. Symbols that none of them could recognize were carved into its sides, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. "What is this place?" Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. She stepped closer to the pedestal, drawn to it despite the overwhelming sense of unease it exuded. "Don't touch it," Jordan warned, pulling her back. His eyes darted nervously around the room, searching for any sign of an escape route. This has to be another trap. Everything in this house is meant to mess with us. But what if it's a clue? Lila countered, her gaze fixed on the glowing symbols. She reached into her bag and pulled out the photograph they'd found in the basement, holding it up next to the pedestal. The symbols on the photo's frame were identical to those on the stone. Look, it's the same. Maybe this is the gate the journal mentioned. A gate? Nate said skeptically, pacing around the pedestal. To where? And how do we even know it's real? For all we know, it could make things worse. Before anyone could respond, the air in the room grew icy, and a low hum filled the space. The glow from the pedestal intensified, casting the room in an eerie blue light. The shadows on the walls began to shift again, taking on distorted forms that seemed to reach for the group. Then, a voice, a deep, guttural whisper, emanated from the pedestal. It spoke in a language none of them recognized, yet the meaning of its words sank into their minds like a cold blade. One must choose. One must stay. The group froze, their fear momentarily overridden by confusion. Well, what does it mean? Chloe stammered, taking a step back. The whisper came again, louder this time. The gate demands balance. One must stay behind to pay the toll, or none may leave. No way, Nate said, shaking his head vehemently. There's no way we're playing by its rules. We'll find another way out. But the pedestal's glow began to pulse, and the shadows on the walls grew more aggressive, stretching toward the group. It was clear the house wasn't bluffing. They had a choice to make, or the house would make it for them. Lila's mind raced as she looked at her friends. Every instinct told her to run. But where would they go? The house had shown it could twist its halls, trap them in endless loops. If the journal was to be believed, the pedestal might be their only chance. But was she willing to let someone stay behind? No one is staying, Chloe said firmly, stepping closer to the pedestal. We'll figure out how to beat this thing without playing by its rules. The whisper came a third time, so loud now that it rattled their bones. Choose, or perish. And then, with horrifying suddenness, the pedestal went dark. The shadows surged forward, and the group's flashlights died simultaneously, plunging them into a darkness so thick it felt alive. Their screams were swallowed by the abyss, and the house groaned once more, its labyrinth reshaping itself. When the lights flickered back on, the group found themselves scattered across different parts of the manor, alone and utterly terrified. The house had made its choice, and the game was far from over. When the darkness lifted, Jordan found himself standing in an unfamiliar room, the oppressive silence pressing down on him like a heavy shroud. His flashlight flickered weakly, its beam barely piercing the dense gloom that surrounded him. The air smelled of mildew and decay, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed somewhere in the distance. He turned slowly, trying to make sense of his surroundings. The room was small and windowless, its walls covered in peeling wallpaper depicting faded floral patterns. A single wooden door stood on the far side, its surface scratched and scarred as if someone, or something, had tried to claw its way through. Jordan's heart raced as he approached the door, his hands trembling. "Hello," he called out, his voice hoarse and barely above a whisper. There was no response, only the faint sound of his own breathing. He pressed his ear to the door, listening for any sign of his friends, but all he could hear was the eerie stillness of the house. Meanwhile, Chloe awoke to find herself in what appeared to be an old nursery. The room was cluttered with broken toys and rotting furniture, the walls adorned with faded drawings of animals that seemed to watch her with lifeless eyes. A chill ran down her spine as she noticed the small, dusty crib in the corner. The mobile above it was spinning slowly, though there was no breeze. "Lila? Nate?" she called out, her voice trembling. She tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic began to set in as she searched the room for another exit, her mind racing with thoughts of the shadow that had pursued them. Lila, on the other hand, found herself in a long, narrow hallway lined with mirrors. Each one reflected her image, but as she moved, she noticed the reflections didn't match her movements. Some were delayed, while others seemed to move of their own accord. Her stomach churned with unease as she realized the reflections were watching her. "Stop it," she whispered, her voice shaking. She turned away from the mirrors, only to find that the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions. "This isn't real," she told herself, but the shadows creeping along the edges of the mirrors suggested otherwise. Nate's surroundings were even more unsettling. He was in what looked like an old ballroom, its grand chandelier hanging precariously from the ceiling. The room was filled with rows of empty chairs, all facing a small stage draped in tattered curtains. As he stepped closer, he noticed the faint sound of music playing, a haunting melody that seemed to come from nowhere. He hesitated, his eyes fixed on the stage. Something about it felt wrong, as if stepping onto it would seal his fate. "Guys," he called out, his voice echoing through the empty room. The music stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Each of them faced their own horrors, the house amplifying their fears and insecurities. For Jordan, it was the feeling of being utterly alone, the sense that he would never find his friends again. For Chloe, it was the eerie sense of being watched, the unseen presence lurking just beyond her vision. Lila's reflections taunted her, whispering things she couldn't quite hear, their distorted faces pressing against the glass. And for Nate, it was the creeping realization that the house wasn't just toying with them. It was learning from them, adapting to their weaknesses. Hours seemed to pass as they wandered through the manor's twisted corridors, each step drawing them further into its malevolent grip. Occasionally, they would hear faint echoes of each other's voices, distorted and distant, as if coming from another dimension. Lila was the first to find a clue, a small, ornate key tucked into a drawer beneath one of the mirrors. The moment she touched it, the whispers grew louder, and the mirrors began to crack, the fractures spreading like spiderwebs. She clutched the key tightly, ignoring the voices that hissed warnings in her ear. Jordan, too, found something, a piece of paper folded neatly on the scratched door he had been too afraid to open. Written on it in a shaky hand were the words, "The house feeds on your fears. Conquer them, or it will consume you." As they each gathered fragments of the truth, the realization began to dawn on them. The house wasn't just trying to scare them. It was testing them, pushing them to their limits to see who would break first. The gate wasn't just a means of escape. It was a reward, a prize for those strong enough to endure the house's torment. But the question lingered in their minds, unspoken yet unavoidable. How much more could they endure before the house claimed them for good? And what would happen to those who failed the test? Jordan gripped the slip of paper tightly, its ominous words etched into his mind. "The house feeds on your fears. Conquer them, or it will consume you." His breath came in shallow bursts as he leaned against the wall, his flashlight flickering weakly in the gloom. The scratched door loomed before him like a sentinel, daring him to open it. He clenched his jaw, steeling himself against the rising tide of dread. "If it feeds on fear," he muttered, "then it's time to starve it." He reached for the doorknob, his hand trembling, and turned it with a decisive twist. The door creaked open, revealing a staircase spiraling downward into pitch-black darkness. Meanwhile, Chloe was still trapped in the nursery, her nerves fraying with every second that passed. She had tried prying open the door, breaking the windows, even screaming at the top of her lungs, but the room refused to yield. The mobile above the crib spun lazily, its faint tinkling melody setting her teeth on edge. She caught sight of something glinting inside the crib, a small, tarnished locket. Hesitating only briefly, she reached for it, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. The instant she touched it, a child's laughter echoed through the room, soft and sweet, yet carrying an undertone of malice. Chloe froze, her blood running cold. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the room for the source of the sound, but she was alone. "Don't let it win," she whispered to herself, clutching the locket tightly. The laughter faded, replaced by a low, guttural hum that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Elsewhere, Lila continued her journey down the endless mirrored hallway, the ornate key burning a hole in her pocket. The fractured reflections distorted her image, warping her features into grotesque caricatures. Some of them sneered, others wept. One even turned its back on her entirely, its shadowy outline whispering something incomprehensible. She forced herself to focus, her eyes fixed straight ahead. "It's not real," she repeated under her breath like a mantra. "None of this is real." But the whispers grew louder, the glass cracking with every step she took. The key in her pocket pulsed with warmth, almost as if guiding her forward. Nate was still in the ballroom, the oppressive silence suffocating him. The chairs and stage seemed to loom closer, though he hadn't moved. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes on him, the sensation burrowing into his psyche. He decided to approach the stage, his curiosity mingling with dread. As he stepped onto the platform, the lights above flickered to life, illuminating the room in harsh, blinding brightness. A spotlight snapped onto him, and a disembodied voice boomed, "Perform." "What?" Nate stammered, shielding his eyes. The voice repeated, "Perform." The chairs were no longer empty. Shadowy figures now occupied them, their featureless faces turned toward him. Nate's knees buckled, but he forced himself to stand. He cleared his throat, his voice shaky as he began to sing a song from their high school's graduation ceremony. The shadowy figures remained silent, their presence unnerving. As he sang, the light began to dim, and the figures dissolved into mist, leaving the room empty once more. A sense of accomplishment washed over him, though it was tempered by the realization that the house had tested him, and he had barely passed. The four friends, scattered and alone, were each beginning to piece together the truth. The house wasn't a random labyrinth of horror. It was deliberate, methodical, and sadistic. It didn't just want their fear, it wanted their submission. Jordan descended the staircase, his flashlight revealing cryptic symbols carved into the walls. Each step seemed to amplify his heartbeat, the air growing colder with every passing second. When he reached the bottom, he found himself in a chamber filled with strange, ancient machinery. A massive clock stood at the center, its hands ticking backward. Chloe examined the locket, prying it open to reveal a tiny photograph inside. It depicted a young girl standing in front of Ravenwood Manor, her expression solemn. On the back of the locket, an inscription read, "Only the brave can escape." Lila reached the end of the mirrored hallway, the key in her hand vibrating as she approached a locked door. The whispers ceased as she inserted the key, a heavy click echoing through the air. The door swung open to reveal a spiraling staircase leading upward, its walls covered in strange runes that seemed to pulse with life. And Nate, shaken but determined, exited the ballroom to find a corridor he hadn't seen before. At the end of the hallway, he spotted a familiar figure, Lila. Relief flooded him, but as he approached, he noticed something strange. Lila's shadow wasn't moving in sync with her. One by one, their paths converged, though the house's grip on them only seemed to tighten. The fragments of the mystery they had uncovered hinted at something far more sinister than any of them could have imagined. The question wasn't just whether they could escape, it was whether they could survive long enough to try. The reunion was bittersweet. Jordan, Chloe, Lila, and Nate stood in the dimly lit corridor, each visibly shaken from their individual ordeals. Relief flickered briefly in their eyes before being snuffed out by the oppressive atmosphere of Ravenwood Manor. They didn't speak at first, their silence filled with unspoken fears. But they knew time wasn't on their side. The house was alive, and it was growing bolder. "What's next?" Chloe finally whispered, her voice trembling. She clutched the locket, its cold surface a grounding force against the chaos around them. Jordan, ever the pragmatist, stepped forward. "We need to keep moving. Staying still only gives this thing more control over us." He glanced at the others, his gaze lingering on Nate, who was pale and visibly rattled. "Are you okay?" Nate nodded weakly, though the dark circles under his eyes betrayed his true state. "It wants something from us," he said, his voice hollow. "In the ballroom, it made me perform. It was like I had to prove myself." Lila, who had been quiet until now, interjected. "It's testing all of us." The mirrors, they showed me things about myself I didn't want to see. It's like the house knows our deepest fears and insecurities. Chloe tightened her grip on the locket. Then we can't give in. If this thing feeds on fear, we have to fight back. But how? Their conversation was cut short by a low, guttural groan that echoed through the corridor. The sound seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, which pulsed faintly as if breathing. The four exchanged nervous glances before Jordan led the way down the hallway, his flashlight casting long, jittery shadows on the cracked plaster. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, its walls narrowing until they had to walk single file. Strange symbols etched into the surfaces began to glow faintly, their pulsating light casting an eerie glow on the group's faces. The air grew colder, and a metallic tang filled their noses, reminiscent of blood. At last, they emerged into a large circular room. At the center stood a massive, ornate pedestal, upon which rested a weathered book bound in what looked like human skin. Surrounding the pedestal were four tall mirrors, each angled toward the book. Their reflections seemed distorted, showing warped versions of the room and themselves. "Don't touch it," Lila warned, eyeing the book with suspicion. "This is too obvious. It's a trap." As if in response, the mirrors began to shimmer, the distorted reflections twisting further. Each one now showed a scene from the past, moments the group had tried to bury. Jordan's reflection depicted him standing over a crying child, his face contorted with guilt. Chloe showed her walking away from a friend who had desperately needed her help. Lila's was her sneaking answers during a crucial exam. Nate's revealed him turning his back on his younger brother during an argument that ended in tragedy. The images were unrelenting, each scene forcing the group to confront their deepest regrets. Chloe let out a choked sob, stepping back from her mirror as if it might reach out and grab her. "This isn't real," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But it is," a voice hissed, echoing around the chamber. It was neither male nor female, young nor old. It was the house itself speaking directly to them for the first time. "You cannot run from your past. It is the foundation upon which this house is built. Leave us alone," Jordan shouted, his voice echoing. He stepped toward the book, his fists clenched. "What do you want from us?" The mirrors flickered, and the voice grew colder. "I want what you have hidden. Your secrets, your shame, the truth you refuse to face. Only when you bare your souls will the house release you." Lila shook her head, panic rising in her chest. "No, it's lying. It just wants to break us." But Nate's resolve was crumbling. "What if it's the only way?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He reached out toward the book, his hand trembling. "No!" Chloe cried, grabbing his arm. "We don't even know what it does." The chamber began to quake, the mirrors cracking as the voice boomed once more. "Decide. Face your truths, or the house will decide for you." In the chaos, the group's unity began to fracture. The house wasn't just testing their fears, it was turning them against each other. And as the tremors intensified, it became clear that their next choice could either lead to their salvation or seal their doom forever. The tremors subsided as quickly as they had started, leaving the group standing in a tense silence. Their breath came in ragged bursts, each of them too shaken to speak. The mirrors no longer reflected distorted images of the past, but instead showed nothing at all, just empty, black voids. The book on the pedestal remained, its pages fluttering slightly as though alive, beckoning them forward with an unseen force. Jordan was the first to break the silence. His voice was low, barely above a whisper. "We need to decide. Do we face this head-on, or do we keep running?" He glanced at the others, his eyes hardening with resolve. "Because if we don't make a choice, the house will make it for us." Chloe shook her head. "I can't. I don't know if I'm ready to face what's in there." She motioned to the book, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "What if the house is lying? What if it's just a trick to break us?" Lila stepped closer to the pedestal, her eyes fixed on the book. "I don't think it's lying," she said quietly. "I think it's trying to show us something. It's offering us a way out. But we have to face what we've been hiding." Her voice trembled, but there was a determination in her eyes that the others couldn't ignore. Nate, who had been standing off to the side, finally spoke up. What if the house is right? What if we have to confront our mistakes? What if it's the only way we can move on from all of this? His voice was barely above a whisper, but there was an unsettling sincerity in it that made the others pause. Jordan turned to Nate, his brow furrowed. You can't be serious. You want to give in to this thing? Nate met his gaze, his expression conflicted. I don't know, he admitted. I'm scared, but I can't shake the feeling that if we don't face what we've done, the house will never let us go. Chloe looked at Nate, her heart heavy. But what about the others? What if we're all just being manipulated? The house is feeding off of our fear, and now it wants our guilt. It's too much. Exactly, Jordan said, stepping forward. That's exactly why we can't give it what it wants. We're already broken enough. We don't need to give it more of us to survive. Lila, however, remained fixated on the book. Maybe that's exactly why we need to face it. Because if we don't, the house will win. She reached out cautiously, her hand hovering just above the book's cover. For a moment, everything in the room seemed to hold its breath. The air was thick with tension. Then, as though in response to her touch, the book slammed shut with a deafening crack. The mirrors shattered into 1,000 shards, and the room seemed to twist and distort around them. The walls closed in, narrowing the corridor until they were trapped. The once cold air grew stifling, thick with an oppressive weight. The house was reacting to their indecision, punishing them for their hesitation. We've lost our chance, Chloe said, panic rising in her voice. It's too late. We've angered it. Jordan's eyes scanned the room, searching for an escape. The air grew heavier, the pressure squeezing the very breath from his lungs. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, growing darker and more tangible. The house was alive, and it was angry. Then, just as it seemed like the house would consume them entirely, the voice spoke again. It was no longer the cold, calculating tone they had heard before. This time, there was a sense of malice in it, a promise of retribution. You have failed, it whispered. You have let your own fears dictate your actions. Now you will suffer the consequences. The ground beneath their feet trembled as the room began to crack and splinter. The walls seemed to close in on them. The once ornate mirrors now shards of jagged glass, reflecting twisted, distorted versions of their faces. The house was taking its toll. It wasn't just feeding off their fear, it was consuming their very identities. What do we do now? Lila asked, her voice filled with despair. How do we stop this? Jordan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped toward the book once more, his hand trembling. We have to do it. We can't turn back now. We either face it or we die here, locked in the house forever. The others watched in stunned silence as Jordan carefully opened the book. The pages were blank, save for a single, handwritten note on the inside cover. The price of truth is sacrifice. The word sent a chill through the group. They had been warned, and now they realized the price was something none of them were prepared to pay. As Jordan stared at the words scrawled in the book, the rest of the group gathered around, their eyes filled with dread. The room had grown colder still, and a strange, unsettling quiet had taken over. The oppressive weight that pressed down on them seemed to magnify with every passing second. It was as though the house itself was waiting, watching, gauging their response to the words they had just uncovered. The price of truth is sacrifice, Jordan muttered almost to himself. The phrase lingered in the air like a curse, each syllable heavier than the last. The others stood back, their expressions a mixture of confusion and terror. What does it mean? Sacrifice what? Lila swallowed hard. Maybe it's asking us to give something up. Something important. But what? She looked at the group, her eyes darting between each of them. We've all faced our darkest moments already. We've seen what we've done. What else could we possibly sacrifice? Chloe clenched her fists, fighting back tears. What if it means our lives? What if it's not just about confronting our past, but about losing something? Or someone? Her voice cracked with emotion, and she glanced at the others, as if pleading for them to understand. Jordan's hand hovered over the book, but he didn't touch it. He knew that touching it again would bring them closer to something irreversible, something they could never undo. We don't know what the consequences will be, he said, his voice steady despite the rising panic inside him. But we have to be careful. There's no telling what kind of power this house has. It's feeding on us. Nate, who had been unusually quiet, stepped forward, his eyes dark with contemplation. We're already so deep in this, aren't we? He said, almost as if speaking to himself. There's no turning back now. We're all too connected to it. We've all felt the house's grip. I think it wants us to give more than just our fears. It wants our souls. The group fell silent at Nate's words. The idea was too horrifying to comprehend, but something in the way he said it made it feel like an inevitable truth. The house had been manipulating them, yes, but perhaps there was more to it. Maybe it wasn't just trying to scare them, it was trying to possess them. Chloe shook her head, unable to accept the notion. No, we can't. We can't let it win. We can't let it take us. But we don't have a choice, Lila replied, her voice tight with fear. We've been inside this house for so long, we don't even know what's real anymore. It knows us. It's seen our every weakness. It will never let us go unless we make the ultimate sacrifice. What if that's what it means? What if we have to give it the very thing it wants most? Our humanity. Jordan's heart raced, but something inside him shifted. A terrifying clarity emerged in the chaos of their conversation. He looked at the others, his eyes scanning each of their faces. They were all scared. They were all questioning what the truth really was. But there was one thing he knew for sure. They had to face whatever came next together. We don't have to give in, Jordan said firmly. The house is trying to break us apart, to make us think there's no other way. But we have the power to choose. We don't need to sacrifice who we are. He slammed the book shut, his hands shaking. We've been trapped by our own guilt, by our own fears. But we can break free of that. But before he could say more, the air grew even colder, the walls closing in on them. A loud, bone-rattling creak echoed through the room, as if the house itself were shifting, preparing for something. The ground beneath their feet cracked, splitting open in jagged lines. A deep, malevolent laugh resonated from the shadows, and the voice they had come to fear boomed throughout the room once again. You cannot escape, it hissed, the sound reverberating off the walls. You will pay the price. You are mine, all of you. There is no running. There is no choice. The temperature dropped even further, and the group huddled closer together, fear evident in their eyes. But Jordan stood tall, refusing to let the house break him. We are not yours, he declared defiantly. We are not your puppets. We're stronger than that. The voice laughed again, cruel and mocking. Very well, it sneered. You will see. You will understand what it means to defy me. Suddenly, the room seemed to collapse inward, a wave of intense pressure pushing them toward the center. Shadows twisted and contorted, forming horrific shapes that clawed and reached for them. The book had vanished, replaced by an unsettling symbol burned into the floor beneath them. It was the same symbol they had seen in the mirrors earlier, a mark of their fears, their regrets, and now, perhaps, their undoing. Nate, wide-eyed, backed away. It's too late. We've already lost. But Jordan didn't waver. He could feel the house's power pressing down on him, but he knew what had to be done. He wasn't ready to give in. Not yet. The others looked to him for guidance. And in that moment, Jordan realized the truth. The true sacrifice wasn't in what they had to give up, but in what they still had to fight for. The group gathered their courage, knowing that the house was playing its final hand. If they could withstand this final trial, perhaps they could reclaim what had been stolen from them. The real test was not whether they would fall, but whether they would stand, united against the darkness that sought to consume them. The house's walls seemed to close in on them, the shadows twisting and writhing, almost as if alive. The pressure on their chests was unbearable, and the oppressive force of the house's malevolent energy was almost too much to endure. Yet, despite the overwhelming fear, Jordan felt a strange calm begin to settle over him. He wasn't sure if it was defiance or resignation, but something in him had hardened. The house had tried to break them down at every turn, but they were still standing. That meant there was something they had yet to understand, something they had missed in all the chaos. The others were trembling, barely holding on to the last threads of hope. Lila's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, but the house had trapped them in a way they hadn't yet figured out. The air was thick with a haunting presence, a presence that seemed to speak directly to their minds, pulling at their darkest memories, their greatest fears. Jordan took a step forward, feeling the weight of the situation bear down on him. His heart was pounding, but he refused to look away. We've come this far. We've faced everything the house has thrown at us, but we still don't understand why. There was a sudden, sharp screech from above. The ceiling began to crack and splinter as if something large and heavy was moving above them. Everyone jumped, but Jordan stood his ground, his gaze still fixed on the center of the room. Something was coming, something far worse than what they had already faced. A low, guttural voice echoed through the house once more, but this time, it wasn't mocking or filled with anger. It was cold, calculating. "You've come so far," it intoned, "but you still don't understand. You never did." The group looked at each other in confusion, but there was an undeniable sense of dread creeping up their spines. The voice seemed to be toying with them, leading them down a path they didn't even know existed. "You think you're fighting to survive," the voice continued, its tone growing darker, more sinister. "But what if I told you that the true horror isn't what you've seen? The true horror isn't the things that lurk in the shadows or the things that scream in the night." Jordan's blood ran cold as the voice seemed to wrap around them, filling their minds with the darkest possible images. It was as though their worst nightmares were being played out before them, things they had buried deep within their psyches. Faces from their past, long-forgotten memories, twisted versions of their greatest regrets. The house wasn't just trying to frighten them. It was showing them the things they had never wanted to see. "You're here because you chose to come," the voice said, its words cutting through the silence like a blade. "Each of you chose to enter this house, to face your pasts, to confront your sins. But what if the real question is why?" Jordan's chest tightened as the truth began to emerge in fragments, pieces of a puzzle he hadn't yet realized he was solving. The house wasn't simply a place of terror. It was a mirror. It was reflecting their darkest selves back at them. They had been brought here, not just by fate or chance, but by their own choices. Lila's voice broke through the growing tension, shaky but determined. "What do you mean, why? We didn't choose this. We didn't choose to be trapped here." The voice laughed, a dry, rasping sound that echoed off the walls. "You didn't choose to be trapped, no. But you chose to return to the place where it all began. You chose to face the things you've tried to forget. That was your decision. That was the price you paid." Jordan's mind raced. The pieces were falling into place. The house didn't just want to feed on their fear. It wanted to reveal the truth. They had all come here for a reason. Each of them had something in their past that they hadn't fully confronted, something they had left behind, buried deep within. The house had only become a catalyst, a force that forced them to relive those moments, to acknowledge their own culpability. "What do you want from us?" Chloe's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried an undeniable weight. "We're already facing everything. What more do you want us to see?" The voice grew quiet for a moment, as if considering the question. Then it spoke again, its tone strangely calm. "You are not here to survive. You are here to understand. The house does not seek your fear. It seeks your repentance." Jordan felt his heart stop. Repentance. The word echoed in his mind like a bell tolling in the distance. Repentance was what had driven him to this point, wasn't it? The need to atone for the mistakes he had made in his life, the people he had hurt, the things he had left undone. But it wasn't just him. Each of them had their own burdens, their own reasons for seeking out this nightmare. They had all come seeking forgiveness in one form or another. But forgiveness wasn't something the house could give. The house wasn't there to absolve them. It was there to show them the full weight of their actions, to make them feel the full consequence of the choices they had made. It was asking them to look into the abyss and find some kind of redemption within themselves, or to drown in the very guilt that had brought them here. "What happens now?" Nate asked, his voice hoarse. "You will choose," the voice replied, its tone now almost tender, as if offering them an ultimatum. "You will either face the truth and find your way out, or you will remain trapped here forever, living in the nightmare of your own creation. The room grew still, the air thick with the weight of that choice. Jordan looked at each of his friends, seeing their fear mirrored in their eyes, but also something else, a glimmer of understanding. They had been brought here not by some malicious force, but by their own need to confront their darkest selves. In that moment, Jordan realized the truth. The real horror wasn't the house, the shadows, or the spirits that haunted them. It was their own inability to forgive themselves. The house had shown them their pasts, their mistakes, and their regrets, but it was up to them to find a way to let go. With a deep breath, Jordan turned to the group, his voice steady despite the uncertainty of the situation. We can't undo what we've done, but we can choose to face it. We can choose to move on, and with that, the true battle began. Not against the house, but against the parts of themselves they had tried so desperately to forget. The air was thick with tension, and the walls of the house seemed to pulse with an oppressive force. They had come to understand the true nature of their situation. It wasn't just about survival. It was about understanding their pasts, their mistakes, and the sins they had left unresolved. The house had become a mirror, reflecting back to them the things they had tried to bury. Yet now, in the face of that truth, Jordan realized something even more unsettling. The house wasn't simply showing them their past. It was testing them. It was pushing them to face their deepest fears, to confront the darkest corners of their souls, and to make a choice that could define their very existence. As they stood in the center of the room, the others seemed lost in their own thoughts, grappling with the weight of what they had just learned. Lila's hands trembled as she reached for Jordan's arm, the once strong woman now reduced to a shell of herself. The fire in her eyes had dulled, replaced by a deep uncertainty. Jordan could see the battle raging within her. The desire to confront her past, to find closure, was at odds with the fear of what that confrontation might reveal. "Do you think we can do this?" Lila asked, her voice soft, almost pleading. "Can we really face everything we've done?" Jordan glanced at the others. Each one of them was battling their own demons, their own regrets. Nate was standing by the window, his face pale, staring out into the night. Chloe was sitting on the floor, her head resting on her knees, as if trying to block out the memories flooding back to her. Even Lila, who had always been the strongest of them all, was now consumed by doubt. "I don't know," Jordan admitted, his voice hoarse. "But we have no choice. If we don't confront what brought us here, we'll never leave. We'll be trapped in this house forever." The weight of his words seemed to sink into the room, each syllable a reminder of their grim reality. They had all come seeking answers, seeking a way out of the torment that had followed them for years. But now, they had come to realize that the answers lay not outside the house, but within themselves. The house had forced them to see the truth, and the truth was that they had never truly confronted their own actions. They had run from their mistakes, buried them under layers of denial, but now they had to face them head-on. "Jordan's right," Chloe spoke up suddenly, her voice trembling but firm. "We can't keep running. We have to face the things we've done, no matter how painful. We owe it to ourselves, and to each other." Nate turned slowly from the window, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and determination. "But how? How do we face it? How do we make it stop?" Jordan took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. The fear that had gripped him moments earlier had begun to dissipate, replaced by a burning resolve. "We can't stop it. Not completely. But we can choose to confront it, to own up to what we've done. We have to stop pretending like it didn't happen. We have to be honest with ourselves." The room fell silent once again, the weight of his words settling heavily over them. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the low hum of the house's ancient timbers creaking under the pressure of the storm outside. It was as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for them to make their next move. Lila stood up slowly, her face pale but resolute. "I've been running from my past for so long," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted to face what I did. But now I realize that if I don't, I'll never be free." Her words struck a chord with the others. It was as if the house had unlocked something within them, a realization that they couldn't escape from their pasts, no matter how hard they tried. The house had brought them here not to punish them, but to show them that the only way forward was through the darkness. "I don't want to be stuck here forever," Nate muttered, his voice raw. "I don't want to keep running from everything I've done. I want to find peace." Jordan nodded. "We all do, and we will, but we have to do it together." The house groaned as if acknowledging their decision. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the oppressive presence seemed to ease, if only for a moment. It was as though the house had allowed them a brief respite, a chance to gather themselves before the next wave of trials would come. The truth had been laid bare before them, and now they had a choice: to face their sins or to remain trapped in a never-ending cycle of guilt and fear. There was no easy path, no guarantee of success, but they had no other choice but to move forward. "I think we should start with the hardest part," Jordan said, his voice steady. "We need to confront the thing that brought us here in the first place. The thing we've all been avoiding." Lila's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but she nodded. "I'll go first. I have to. I need to face what I did. I need to stop running." One by one, the others followed her lead. Each of them had something they needed to confront, something they needed to say. The house had shown them their pasts, but now it was up to them to reclaim their futures. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for their very souls. As they gathered in the center of the room, ready to begin their confessions, the house seemed to watch them with a knowing gaze. It had shown them their fears, their regrets, their mistakes, but it had also given them the strength to face them. The true test was not the house itself, but their ability to face the darkness within. Jordan took a step forward, his voice steady as he began to speak, knowing that once he spoke the words, there would be no turning back. But he was ready. He had no choice. He would face it, just as they all would. For in the end, it was the only way to escape the house, and the only way to escape the nightmares that had followed them for so long. As the first words of confession began to echo through the room, the atmosphere in the house shifted. The oppressive heaviness that had once hung over them began to dissipate, like fog lifting at dawn. But the respite was fleeting, for each word they spoke was not only a release but a deepening of the wounds they had long buried. Jordan felt a knot tighten in his stomach as Lila began to speak. "I've spent so much time blaming myself," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I could outrun the guilt. But I've never been able to forgive myself for what happened that night. I was too weak to stop it, too afraid to speak out when I should have." Her confession struck a raw nerve within the group, and for a moment, no one moved, as if the words themselves had paralyzed them. Lila's admission was a revelation, not just for herself, but for all of them. It was a revelation that forced them to confront the extent of the darkness they had been running from. What happened that night wasn't just an event. It was the catalyst that had set their entire lives on a trajectory they had never intended. And now, as they gathered together in this cursed house, the past was insisting on being addressed. Jordan looked around the room, seeing the same expressions of shock and understanding mirrored in the faces of the others. Chloe, who had been sitting motionless by the window, now looked up, her eyes wide with the same realization that had struck them all. "It's not just about us, is it? It's about everything we've failed to face. Everything we've ignored and tried to forget," she said quietly. Her words lingered in the air, and Jordan could feel the weight of them pressing down on him. It was true. They weren't just haunted by the things they had done in the past. They were haunted by the things they had allowed to go unaddressed, the times they had turned a blind eye when they should have acted. The truth was that their silence had contributed just as much to the unraveling of their lives as any action they had taken. Lila seemed to sense the shift in the group's energy. "I know what I did was unforgivable," she continued, her voice stronger now. "But I have to say it. I have to speak the truth, even if it means losing everyone here. Even if it means facing the consequences of my own actions." Jordan's heart raced as he listened. He knew that Lila's confession was only the beginning. Her honesty, her willingness to confront her own guilt, had set the stage for something bigger, something that they could no longer avoid. The house had forced them into this moment. It had revealed their greatest fears, their darkest secrets, and it was clear that there could be no healing without honesty. They would have to confront everything, not just the things they had done, but the things they had allowed to fester and rot in the corners of their lives. "I've spent years pretending to be someone I'm not," Nate spoke up next, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought if I ignored it, if I just kept moving forward, the guilt would go away. But it never did. It's always been there, gnawing at me, reminding me that I can't escape it." Jordan nodded as Nate's words resonated within him. It wasn't just their actions they were confronting. It was the consequences of their inaction, their failure to be the people they could have been. It was the weight of their regrets that had kept them tethered to this cursed place. They had never dealt with the aftermath of their choices, and the house had brought them to the brink of facing that truth. As Nate fell silent, Chloe spoke again, this time her voice breaking with emotion. "I tried to convince myself that it didn't matter. I thought if I buried the memories deep enough, they'd stay hidden forever. But I can't ignore it anymore. I can't live with the lie." Each confession seemed to unravel a bit more of the facade they had built around themselves. The house had torn down the walls they had spent so long constructing, revealing the raw, vulnerable truth beneath. It was clear now that they had been living in a false reality, one where they thought they could outrun their pasts. But no one could escape the consequences of their actions forever, not even in a place as seemingly inescapable as this house. For a moment, the room was silent. The air was thick with the gravity of what they had said, and the knowledge that there was no going back. They were no longer just a group of students caught in a tragic accident. They were individuals bound together by shared guilt, by shared mistakes. And they could no longer pretend that they were innocent in the face of what had happened. The past had caught up to them, and now it was demanding payment. Lila, her face drawn with exhaustion, took a deep breath and looked at each of them in turn. "We can't change what we've done, but we can change what happens next. We can't run anymore." Her words were simple but profound. They were no longer just confessing their sins. They were acknowledging the power of choice. The choice to either continue hiding from the truth or to face it head-on and seek some form of redemption. It wasn't about erasing their past. It was about learning from them and choosing a path that could, in some way, undo the damage. Jordan realized then that the house had served as a mirror, not just to their past, but to their potential for change. It had shown them the darkest corners of their souls, but it had also given them the opportunity to grow, to move beyond the mistakes that had defined them for so long. "I don't know what the next step is," Jordan said, his voice steady now. "But I know we can't stay here, wallowing in our guilt. We have to move forward together. We have to break free of the past, or it will keep us trapped here forever." The others nodded, one by one, as the weight of his words sank in. There was no easy way out. There was no simple resolution to the horrors they had faced. But there was a chance for something better. There was the possibility of redemption, not just for themselves, but for each other. And as they stood together in that house, haunted by their pasts, but united in their resolve, Jordan felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, it didn't seem impossible. The house had shown them their darkest truths, but it had also given them the strength to face them. Now, they just had to find a way to make peace with what they had done, and perhaps find a way to leave the past behind. The silence that followed their shared confessions was both heavy and cathartic, but it was not a silence of peace. Rather, it was the kind of quiet that falls when a storm has passed, leaving in its wake a sense of inevitability. The house, its walls seemingly listening to their every word, had borne witness to the dark truths each of them had kept hidden for years. And yet, no matter how much they confessed, no matter how many truths were laid bare, the feeling of unease never truly lifted. The shadows in the corners of the room still seemed to stretch toward them, reminding them that even in the act of confession, there could be no true peace without paying the price. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jordan found himself wondering if there could ever be redemption for any of them. It was not an abstract concept anymore. It was a tangible weight pressing down on them all. The room felt smaller now, as though the confessions had drawn in the very air, making it harder to breathe. Each word had been like a stone dropped into a well, and now they were all left standing at the edge, staring into the abyss of their actions. Lila, her voice trembling, broke the silence. I've been running from this for so long. I thought if I just buried it deep enough, I could move on. But now I'm wondering if that was just another way of punishing myself. Maybe I've been punishing all of us by not facing it sooner. Her words hung in the air, a bitter truth that no one wanted to confront. They had all been running, not just from the events of that night, but from the consequences of their own actions, their own inability to stop the spiraling path that had led them here. There had been moments where they could have turned back, where they could have spoken up or taken action to prevent the disaster from unfolding. But they hadn't. And now, as they sat in this house of ghosts, they were confronted with the stark reality of that inaction. We've all been living in a prison of our own making, Nate muttered. He ran a hand through his hair, the frustration evident in his voice. But I'm starting to think that maybe we've been deceiving ourselves. The house doesn't just want us to confess. It wants something more. Jordan turned to him, a knot forming in his chest. What do you mean? Nate looked around the room, his eyes flicking from one person to another. We've confessed our sins, our regrets, but we've never asked ourselves why this is happening. Why now? Why this house? The question hung in the air, unanswered but pregnant with meaning. What had brought them here? Why had they been drawn to this house, of all places? It wasn't as if they had come here of their own accord. It was as though something or someone had orchestrated their arrival, pulled them into a web of guilt and fear. It was easy to see the house as a mere backdrop to their troubled lives, but Nate's words suggested there was something deeper, something beyond the tangible that was driving them to this breaking point. Chloe, who had been silent for much of the conversation, finally spoke, her voice quiet but determined. What if forgiveness doesn't come from us? What if the house wants us to see that we can't forgive ourselves alone? Maybe it's about something more, something beyond our control. Jordan felt a chill crawl up his spine as Chloe's words hit him with a force he wasn't ready for. What if she was right? What if they were wrong to believe that forgiveness was something they could earn or give to themselves? What if they were being tested by something greater than their own guilt? The idea was both terrifying and liberating. Could they truly be at the mercy of the house? Or was it their own lack of belief in redemption that had kept them trapped? I don't know if we can find peace here, Jordan admitted, his voice hoarse. Maybe the house is showing us that there is no peace. Maybe there is only the price we must pay. Lila looked up at him, her eyes wet with unshed tears. And what if the price is more than we can bear? The question lingered in the room, unspoken but understood. What was the price of forgiveness? Was it a heavy toll, one that none of them could afford? Or was it a test, a way for them to prove their willingness to change, to sacrifice what they held dear in order to truly heal? The air grew colder, and the silence stretched once more. Each of them was lost in their own thoughts, wrestling with the implications of what they had just said. What had they truly learned about themselves? What had the house shown them that they had failed to see before? The house, it seemed, had its own twisted sense of justice. It wanted them to understand something more profound than the simple act of confession. It wanted them to recognize that forgiveness, true forgiveness, was not just about speaking the truth, but about embracing the cost of redemption. As Jordan sat there, he realized that the house had not only uncovered their deepest secrets, but it had also shown them the price they would have to pay for a chance at healing. There could be no going back, no undoing the damage of the past. The road to redemption was not just about facing their sins. It was about accepting that they had already paid a price. And in the end, they would either rise above it or be consumed by it. We've been given a choice, Jordan said, his voice steady now. The question is, are we willing to pay the price for our redemption? And if we are, what will that price be? The room seemed to hold its breath as they all considered his words. For the first time since their arrival, they could see that this journey, this nightmare, was not just about confronting their past. It was about choosing whether or not to accept the consequences of their choices and, ultimately, to embrace the burden of redemption. And as the house stood silent around them, they realized that the price they would have to pay was not just one of guilt, but one of sacrifice. They were trapped in this house, but they were also trapped by their own choices. The real question was whether they had the strength to move beyond the past and face the darkness of their own hearts. And as the night stretched on, Jordan realized that the answers might not be as simple as they had hoped. The weight of the last few days had taken its toll on each of them. They had come to this house under the assumption that confronting their past would bring some form of closure, some kind of peace. But the house had proven to be far more complex than they could have imagined. The darkness that loomed over them was not simply an external force, but a reflection of the darkness within themselves, an aspect of their identities that they had never fully reckoned with. Every confession, every word spoken, seemed to make the shadows grow deeper, as though the house had become a mirror to their souls. Jordan sat at the center of the room, the others scattered around him, each lost in their own thoughts. The sense of fear that had initially gripped them had slowly evolved into something else, something more suffocating. It wasn't just the house that frightened them now. It was the realization that their lives had been shaped by choices, by actions that had set them on a path they could no longer avoid. The past, with all its unresolved mistakes, seemed to cling to them like a heavy shroud, refusing to let go. Lila was the first to break the silence. "I keep thinking about what Nate said," she murmured, almost as if speaking to herself, "about how this house wants something from us. But what if it's not just about facing the past? What if it's about facing what we've become because of it?" Her words hung in the air, and Jordan could feel the shift in the room. It was one thing to confront what they had done. It was another to confront who they had become because of it. The house, in its twisted way, wasn't just interested in their guilt or their past actions. It was interested in the lasting effects those actions had on them as individuals. The choices they had made in the past had shaped the people they were now. And perhaps it was that transformation, that corruption, that the house sought to expose. Nate shifted uncomfortably, his face taut with the strain of thinking too hard. "It's more than just a reflection of who we used to be," he said slowly. "The house isn't just reminding us of our mistakes. It's making us see how we've let those mistakes define us. It's asking us if we've allowed our past to consume us, to become who we are now." Jordan considered this, the weight of the truth settling deep within him. He thought about the years he had spent running from his past, the way he had justified his actions, always telling himself that time would heal the wounds. But time hadn't healed anything. It had only buried the pain deeper, covered it with layers of denial, until it was so far beneath the surface that he had convinced himself it was gone. But the house had torn those layers away. It had forced him to see the truth. He had been defined by his past, not freed from it. "I didn't realize how much I had let my guilt control me," Jordan admitted, his voice quiet. "I thought I could keep moving forward, that if I just ignored it, it would go away. But it hasn't. It's always been there in the background, shaping every decision I made, every relationship I tried to form." Chloe, who had been listening intently, nodded. "I think that's the point, isn't it?" Her voice was steady, but there was an undeniable tremor beneath it. "The house isn't here to let us forget. It's here to make us face what we've become, not just what we've done. And the more we try to run from it, the more it pulls us back, forces us to confront what we're hiding from." The air in the room grew thick with realization. The house wasn't just a place of punishment. It was a place of reckoning, a place where the past would come alive and force them to face not only their mistakes, but the consequences of those mistakes on their very identities. It was as if the house were a living entity, one that thrived on their fear, on their reluctance to truly see themselves for what they had become. It had no interest in their apologies and their confessions. It wanted them to understand the far-reaching effects of their actions, the way they had become prisoners of their own choices. Lila stood up abruptly, her hands trembling as she spoke. "But why? Why us? Why now? What is it that the house wants from us?" Jordan's mind raced, his thoughts tumbling over each other as he tried to make sense of the situation. It had become clear to him that the house wasn't just a passive observer of their suffering. It was orchestrating their experience, guiding them through a process of transformation, forcing them to confront the darkest parts of themselves. But what was the endgame? What was the house trying to achieve by putting them through this relentless trial? "I don't know," he admitted finally, his voice hoarse. But I think the house wants us to understand that we've become trapped by our own actions. It wants us to see that we've been living in the shadows of our pasts. And until we acknowledge that, we'll never truly move forward. Maybe it's not about forgiveness at all. Maybe it's about release. The word release hung in the air, a possible answer to the mounting questions that had plagued them for so long. What if they had been wrong in their thinking? What if they weren't meant to seek forgiveness from the house or from each other, but from themselves? What if the true purpose of this house, of this nightmare, was to force them to let go of the burdens they had carried for so long and find a way to move forward, not by erasing the past, but by accepting it? Nate's eyes widened as the realization began to dawn on him. Release, not forgiveness, he muttered almost to himself. We've been asking for something we can't give each other. But if we could release ourselves from the weight of our guilt, if we could stop letting it control us. The thought was incomplete, but the implications were profound. Could they truly let go of the past, of the versions of themselves they had become because of it? Could they release the hold that guilt had on them, allowing them to break free from the cycles of shame and regret that had defined their lives? The more they thought about it, the more it felt like a possible way out, if only they could find the strength to make that leap. The house seemed to respond, its walls creaking, as though it, too, was acknowledging their realization. There was no going back now. They had entered the house seeking answers, seeking to confront their pasts, but now they were faced with the far more difficult task of confronting their present selves, the people they had become because of the choices they had made. The house had shown them the darkness of their pasts, but it was now showing them the darkness within. The question now was not how to escape the house, but how to escape the shadows that had followed them for so long. The answer, it seemed, lay not in fighting the past, but in releasing it, in accepting that they could no longer be defined by their mistakes. And as the night stretched on, Jordan felt a faint glimmer of hope flicker in the distance, a hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way out of the darkness that had haunted them for so long. The realization from the previous night hung over them like an unseen force. They had understood, in some strange and terrifying way, that the house wasn't merely a structure filled with ghosts of their past. It was a reflection of their inner turmoil, a tangible manifestation of their unresolved conflicts. As they made their way through the dimly lit hallways, Jordan and the others could feel the weight of this understanding in their bones. They no longer had the luxury of seeing their situation as something separate from themselves. The house had become a crucible, a place where they would have to be melted down and reformed. Jordan could hardly think of a time when he felt more exposed. The walls seemed to close in with every step they took, as if the house itself were watching, waiting for their next move. And yet, the tension in the air had shifted. It was no longer the terror of an unknown force that threatened them, but the realization that they were standing at the crossroads of their own redemption, or their damnation. The house had given them a choice: confront the depths of who they had become, or continue down the path of self-destruction they had unwittingly walked for so long. The fear now lay not in the unknown, but in the power they held over their own fates. As the group gathered once more in the grand hall, Lila was the first to speak. "We can't just keep running. We've been doing that our whole lives, haven't we? Running from what we've done, from what we've become. But it's catching up to us." Her voice was steady, but laced with the exhaustion of someone who had already walked this road too many times before. "We need to face it. All of it." Her words struck a chord in Jordan. He had spent years pretending that his past was just a distant memory, an irrelevant chapter that no longer had any bearing on his life. But the house had shown him how wrong he was. Every action, every choice, every word had rippled outward, creating consequences he could no longer ignore. They had all been running, trying to outrun the ghosts of their pasts. But now those ghosts were here, standing before them. And they weren't going anywhere. Nate's voice interrupted his thoughts. "But what if we can't?" His words were raw, full of the doubt that had begun to seep into their hearts. What if facing it isn't enough? What if it only makes things worse? The group fell into a heavy silence. The question hung in the air, a stark reminder of the fear that had always held them back. Could they truly face the things they had done and still move forward? Or would the weight of their guilt crush them under its immense pressure? Jordan could feel his pulse quicken as the reality of the situation began to set in. The house was no longer a mere test of their courage. It had become a mirror that would not let them look away. "We have to," Chloe said, her voice quiet but firm. "Because if we don't, we'll never be free. We've spent our lives running from our mistakes, but the truth is that they've already defined us. Whether we face them now or not, we'll continue to be shackled by them forever. This house is showing us that we can't escape the consequences of our actions. We've already made the choice by not confronting them." Her words hung in the air, and Jordan felt the weight of them in a way that struck him to his core. This wasn't about finding a way out of the house. This wasn't even about escaping the horrors they had witnessed. It was about finding a way out of the prison they had built for themselves, the prison of their own denial and avoidance. The house had only one rule: you couldn't run. Not anymore. But even as the group came to this understanding, a new question began to form. What would happen when they finally faced the truth? What would it mean for them to stand in the presence of their past mistakes, to acknowledge the harm they had caused, the pain they had inflicted, and the lives they had altered forever? The idea of redemption seemed almost impossible, a distant and unattainable dream. But was it possible? Was there a way for them to reclaim what had been lost? Jordan found himself lost in thought, the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. To acknowledge the past was one thing, but to face it fully, without the comforting veil of denial, was something else entirely. It was a terrifying proposition, one that felt almost unnatural. How could they bear the full weight of the truth without being consumed by it? "None of us are the people we were," Lila added softly, almost as if to answer his unspoken thoughts. "But that doesn't mean we're beyond redemption. We just have to stop pretending that we can move forward without dealing with what we've done." Her words felt like a quiet epiphany, a turning point in their journey. They had spent so much time thinking about what they had lost, about how the house had torn apart their carefully constructed lives, that they had forgotten something crucial. They still had a choice. The house might have revealed their darkest secrets, but it had not yet stolen their capacity to change. The possibility of redemption, of transformation, was still within their grasp. It was then that they all understood redemption wasn't something the house could give them. It was something they had to take for themselves. The house might have shown them the depth of their mistakes, but it could not force them to accept or forgive themselves. That ultimately was something only they could decide. But how? How could they begin this process of self-forgiveness when the scars of their past were so deep, so indelible? For the first time since their arrival, Jordan felt a flicker of hope amidst the crushing weight of their reality. Perhaps, just perhaps, the answer lay not in seeking absolution from the house, but in seeking it from themselves. They had already seen how deeply their choices had shaped their lives. Maybe now it was time to see what those same choices could do when faced with the possibility of change. The house had already forced them to confront their darkest selves. But now, as they stood together in the thickening gloom, they realized that the real challenge had only just begun. Could they overcome the shadow of their choices, or would they be forever defined by them? Only time and their own courage would tell. As the heavy silence enveloped the group, Jordan couldn't help but feel the tension in the air grow. The decision to confront their past was made, but it felt like stepping into a void, a place where everything they had ever known would be tested. The truth was no longer something they could shy away from. It was an inevitable force, crashing toward them like a freight train. But what was the price of this truth? Was there any cost to uncovering the deepest parts of themselves? And if so, were they willing to pay it? Jordan glanced around at the faces of his friends, all of them looking just as uncertain as he felt. Lila, usually so composed, had her hands clenched tightly together, her knuckles white with strain. Nate was fidgeting, his foot tapping against the floor in nervous rhythm. Chloe, ever the optimist, had a look of determination in her eyes, but there was a quiet unease about her that spoke volumes. Everyone had their own fear, their own ghosts to face. The house had peeled away their facades, but now they were left standing raw, exposed, vulnerable. The truth, Jordan realized, was not some abstract concept. It was an entity all its own. It could free them, yes, but it could also destroy them. The more they uncovered about their pasts, the more they realized that there was no coming back from certain revelations. Each of them carried a burden, an act or decision that could alter the way they saw themselves forever. And yet, the idea of retreating into denial felt even worse. To ignore the past was to let it fester, to allow it to continue poisoning them from the inside. It was a catch-22, a battle between the torment of knowing and the torment of ignorance. "We have to face it," Lila said, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady, but there was an underlying tension that betrayed her own internal struggle. "We've been running from ourselves for too long. We can't keep pretending that what happened in the past doesn't matter. We have to own it, no matter what it costs." Nate shifted uncomfortably. "But what if it's too much? What if we're not ready for what we might find?" His voice was tinged with doubt, a reminder of how deep the fear ran. "What if it breaks us?" Chloe shook her head, her expression firm. "It's better to break than to stay in pieces. If we don't confront what we've done, we'll never heal. We'll just keep bleeding out, slowly, until there's nothing left." Her words hung in the air, and Jordan couldn't help but agree. They had been bleeding for so long, whether they realized it or not. The scars they carried were not physical. They were emotional, psychological. Each of them had done something they regretted, something that had left a permanent mark. And in their attempts to bury those memories, they had only allowed them to grow stronger, more toxic. "What if the truth is more than we can bear?" Nate asked, his voice breaking slightly. "What if it's something we can never take back?" That was the crux of the issue, wasn't it? The truth, once uncovered, could not be undone. It was a permanent shift in the way they saw themselves and each other. And yet, to stay in ignorance was a slow death. Jordan understood this now more than ever. The house had forced them to confront their pasts in ways they never could have imagined. But what would happen once the truth was fully revealed? Would they find the strength to move forward? Or would they be consumed by their own revelations? "We can't let fear hold us back," Jordan said, his voice barely a whisper. The words surprised him as much as they surprised the others. He hadn't realized until that moment how badly he had needed to hear them, how badly he had needed to believe that he could be strong enough to face the consequences of his actions. The others looked at him, and for the first time in what felt like ages, Jordan saw a flicker of hope in their eyes. It was as if, in that moment, they all realized something. They had the power to change. But it would come at a price. The truth wasn't just a tool for liberation. It was a weapon. It could tear them apart, or it could put them back together. The risk was inherent, and yet there was no other path forward. "We face it together," Chloe said, her voice steady. "We've made it this far. Whatever happens, we do this together." Jordan nodded. He could feel the weight of the decision settling deeper into his bones. This was no longer just about confronting the house or its twisted inhabitants. It was about confronting themselves, their choices, their very souls. The house had already shown them their darkest secrets, but the true test would come when they finally had to admit those secrets to themselves. As they stood together in the shadowed hallway, each of them caught in their own whirlwind of thoughts and fears, Jordan realized one undeniable truth. There would be no going back. The house had already broken them down. Now it was up to them to rebuild. They had been given the opportunity to face their pasts, to come to terms with their mistakes and their pain. But would it be enough? Could they truly heal? Or would the weight of their past crush them under its unforgiving pressure? "Let's get it over with," Lila said, her voice tight but resolute. "Let's face whatever it is we're hiding from." With those words, the group took their first step into the unknown, each one bracing for the revelation that would come next. They had no idea what awaited them, but they knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back. As the group stepped into the heart of the house, the atmosphere thickened with the weight of unspoken truths. The walls, once eerily silent, now seemed to pulse with anticipation, as if the house itself was aware of the monumental moment unfolding within it. It was as though time itself had slowed, and every step they took was a silent prayer, a desperate plea for the courage to confront what lay ahead. The house, a silent observer of their every move, had held their secrets long enough. Now, it was their turn to reclaim those truths and face the consequences. Jordan's heart pounded in his chest as he led the group deeper into the labyrinth of corridors. Each door they passed seemed to whisper, urging them to turn back, to retreat into the safety of ignorance. But Jordan knew that retreat was no longer an option. The truth had already clawed its way to the surface, and there was no denying it. Each of them had been holding on to something for far too long, and the house had revealed it all. Each fear, each regret, each dark corner of their pasts. The only way to escape was to embrace it, to acknowledge what had been done, and, perhaps, find a way to move forward. Do you think we're ready for this? Lila's voice broke the heavy silence, her words laced with uncertainty. What if we've made a mistake coming here? What if the truth is worse than we imagined? Her question hung in the air, unanswered. The group had come this far, yet doubt lingered like a cloud, threatening to undo all of their progress. Jordan understood her fear. They were standing on the precipice of something irreversible, and none of them knew what awaited them at the bottom. But despite the fear gnawing at his insides, he couldn't shake the feeling that they had to see this through. To stop now would mean giving up the only chance they had left to escape the grip of their pasts. I don't think we have a choice, Nate said quietly. We've been running from this for so long. We can't keep hiding forever. Jordan nodded in agreement. Nate's words were simple, yet they carried the weight of everything they had been through. This wasn't just about facing their fears. It was about accepting who they were, flaws and all. The house had shown them the worst parts of themselves, but it had also shown them their strength, their resilience. To turn back now would be to deny everything they had learned. The journey they had begun, however painful, was the only path forward. As they reached the final door, the one that had been locked for so long, the group paused. The room beyond was shrouded in darkness, as though it were waiting for them, its secrets hidden in the shadows. The key, the one they had been searching for, was in their hands. But would unlocking it open a door they weren't prepared to walk through? Lila took a deep breath. It's now or never. With trembling hands, she turned the key. The door creaked open, revealing a room bathed in an eerie, unnatural light. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of dust, and something far more sinister. As they stepped inside, the temperature seemed to drop, and Jordan felt a chill run down his spine. The walls were covered in strange symbols, their meanings lost to time. But one thing was clear. This was where it all began. The heart of the house, the source of its power, lay within this room. At the center of the room stood an altar, ancient and worn. Upon it, a book lay open, its pages yellowed with age. The ink on the pages seemed to shift, moving like shadows, as if the words themselves were alive. Jordan could feel his breath catch in his throat. This was the final piece of the puzzle, the key to understanding everything. But as his eyes scanned the pages, his mind reeled. The truth was more horrifying than he could have imagined. "This is it," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. "This is what we were meant to find." The others crowded around, their gazes fixed on the book, their faces pale with fear. The symbols on the wall seemed to come alive, swirling around them, pulling them into a trance. The house, it seemed, had been waiting for them to unlock this final mystery. But as they stood there, unable to tear their eyes away from the book's pages, something shifted. A presence, dark and malevolent, filled the room. The air grew heavier, suffocating. Jordan's heart raced as he realized what had been happening all along. The house wasn't just a place, it was alive. It had been feeding on their fears, their guilt, and their secrets, growing stronger with every lie they told and every truth they buried. And now, as they stood at its heart, the house had become more than just a physical entity. It was a manifestation of everything they had been running from. The darkness was not in the house itself. It was in them, in their pasts, in the lies they had told themselves for years. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled. The room seemed to shift, the walls closing in. The book began to glow, its pages turning faster and faster. as if being propelled by an unseen force. The house was not merely revealing their secrets, it was consuming them. The truth, they realized too late, came at a price. And that price was everything they had left. "We need to get out of here," Nate shouted, panic rising in his voice. But it was too late. The door slammed shut, trapping them inside. The walls were closing in, the symbols on the walls twisting into grotesque shapes, their meanings now clear. The house had claimed them, body and soul. In that moment, as the darkness swallowed them whole, Jordan understood. The truth they had sought had never been a means of liberation. It had always been the house's tool, its weapon, to claim them as its own. The final reckoning had come, and they had no way of escaping its grasp. The darkness that had once surrounded the house now seemed to settle within it, an unnatural stillness that pressed in from all sides. The walls, once alive with shadows, were now eerily silent. The symbols that had twisted and writhed in the previous chapter had become inert, as if the house itself had exhausted the last of its strength. But even in this silence, a palpable sense of dread hung in the air. It was the calm before the storm, the quiet before the final, devastating realization that the house had not yet finished with them. Jordan stood frozen, his body numb with terror, but his mind racing. The walls around them were not simply closing in physically. They were collapsing on the very essence of their beings. The air was thick with the weight of everything they had faced in this place. The lies they had uncovered, the guilt that had bound them to their pasts, and the fear that had kept them trapped in a never-ending cycle of torment. Every secret they had tried to bury, every truth they had attempted to hide, had been dragged into the light, and now there was no escaping its grasp. But what struck Jordan the hardest was the realization that the house, in all its malevolent power, had never been the true enemy. It had merely been a mirror, reflecting their inner turmoil and darkest fears. The true horror was not the house itself, but the part of them that had allowed it to fester, to grow stronger with every passing year. The house was a reflection of their own weaknesses, the darkness that lived in the corners of their souls, and now that darkness had come to claim them. "Is it over?" Lila's voice broke through the thick silence, her words trembling as if unsure of their own truth. She had always been the one to question, to seek answers, and now that the answers had been revealed, she was left with nothing but an aching void. "I don't know," Jordan whispered, his throat tight. His eyes shifted to the others. Nate, Chloe, and the rest of the group stood in stunned silence, as though they had been trapped in a nightmare from which they could not wake. They had come to the house seeking closure, seeking to understand what had happened to them all those years ago. But instead, they had uncovered something far darker, something they had never been prepared to face. The very idea of closure now seemed impossible. The air in the room began to hum, a low, vibrating sound that seemed to seep into their bones. It was as if the house itself was breathing, drawing in a final, desperate breath before it exhaled its last. But this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something far more terrifying. The house had fed on their fear for so long, and now it was ready to consume the last remnants of their humanity. Jordan's pulse quickened as he felt the ground beneath him shift. It was subtle at first, a slight tremor that he thought might have been his imagination, but then the vibrations grew stronger. The house was alive, and it was fighting back. The walls groaned as if they were about to cave in, and the floor buckled beneath their feet. The book that had opened the final door to their demise began to glow once more, its pages turning violently as if driven by a force beyond comprehension. "No!" Chloe screamed, her voice cracking. "It's still not done. We have to stop it." But how could they stop something that had already taken everything from them? The house had been built on their fear, and now it was feeding on their despair. They had thought they could escape, that the truth would set them free. But in reality, the truth had led them here, into the heart of darkness where there was no escape, no redemption. The house had become a prison, and they were its final, unwilling inhabitants. Jordan could feel the weight of the air pressing down on him. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think clearly. The walls seemed to be closing in tighter now, and the symbols on them had begun to glow with an eerie, pulsating light. They were moving again, shifting like living creatures, twisting and contorting into new forms. The air was thick with the scent of decay, as though the house itself was rotting from the inside out. Suddenly, the door to the room, the one that had slammed shut earlier, opened. But instead of offering an escape, it revealed a new horror. A figure stood in the doorway, draped in shadows, its face obscured by darkness. The figure didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, its very essence a malevolent force that seemed to radiate from the very air around it. Jordan felt a cold shiver run down his spine, and he instinctively took a step back. This was no ordinary figure. It was the manifestation of everything they had feared, a physical representation of the house's power. "We've been waiting for you," the figure whispered, its voice both familiar and foreign. It was a voice they had heard in their nightmares, in the whispers of the house itself. And in that moment, Jordan realized the truth they had been running from all along. The house was not a place, not a structure. It was a force, a living entity, feeding on the very essence of human fear. And now, it was ready to consume them completely. As the figure stepped forward, the room seemed to collapse inward, the walls stretching and warping like elastic. The shadows seemed to close in around them, suffocating them in their own terror. There was no escape, no hope left. The house had claimed them, body and soul. They had come seeking the truth, but they had found only the darkness within themselves. And now, that darkness was all that remained. In the final moments, as the house's grip tightened around them, Jordan understood. There was no such thing as closure, no final reckoning that could erase the past. They had been part of the house's story all along, each of them a chapter in its never-ending nightmare. And now, as the last breath of the house exhaled, they were nothing more than whispers in the wind, lost to the world they had once known. The house had won.